Okay, so I'm hoping this is something that you are still very familiar with from when you took biology. Um, but let's get on with it. Evolution and natural selection, really the, the, the cornerstone of biology. So the idea is that our genome, the total set of genes that make up our DNA, that are found in our DNA, are constantly subject to change, which we call mutations, which happen just as a result of natural interactions with the environment around us, whether it's high energy gamma rays and X rays, ultraviolet rays coming from the sun and outer space, to mutagenic compounds that are taken into our body, to natural sources of radiation that are just found in the environment. These things damage DNA, and then when the DNA repairs itself, sometimes it repairs itself incorrectly, and this is called a mutation. And these are totally random, and most of these mutations don't do a thing. And then some of those that do cause something to happen, they cause a change in the protein that's coded for by a gene. Most of those changes are either uh, unimportant, they don't make much difference, or they are deleterious, they are harmful. But every once in a while, one of these mutations actually produces a protein that makes a trait a little bit better for the situation in which an organism finds itself. And if that's the case, then that gene is more likely to get expressed, and therefore evolution is going to occur. Evolution is just the gradual change in the genetic makeup of organisms over time as a result of a combination of random mutations and what we call selective pressures, which make advantageous genes more likely to be found in the population and disadvantageous genes to be less likely to be found. So here's just a little graphic I put together to help you see this, and hopefully it does a job. So basically, let's just say that if we look at a population of bugs, most of them are red and one of them is green. Okay, and let's just say they typically live in an environment that's white. Don't ask me why. I'm just trying to make a point. Now, for whatever reason, the background they live in happens to turn green. All right. Now it turns out that all of a sudden this recessive allele this one had, just through some random chance, turns out to be advantageous now. Well, what happens is predators see these red ones and eat them. This guy blends in, so what happens is that the genes that made these ones red are selected against. And the ones that made these guys blend in are now advantageous, and so they're more likely to become predominant in the population. So over time, we see a trend away from being red and towards being green. And given enough time, this can lead to what we call speciation. Over time, there's enough change in the genome that it no longer is the same species that it started out as. And so here's a classic example that's known from the fossil record. It's very well documented in fossils from the that would be from the Cenozoic. Uh, yeah, from the Cenozoic. So basically, what happens is over time, these small changes just continue to build up and build up and build up until we start with this five-fingered mammal and we end up with this hoofed animal that we all know of as a horse. But this change happens gradually over time through a series of selections. And it's just this constant mutation that makes it happen. So let's look at it this way. We could have what's called artificial selection. Let's just say that I want to have a dog that has a very, very long nose and is very, very fluffy. Well, what I would do is I would have dogs, and I'd look around and go like, that one over there has a long nose. I'm going to breed the ones with a long nose. And if they have a short nose, I'm not going to breed them. That one over there is fuzzy. I'm only going to breed the ones that are fuzzy over here. So eventually I get fuzzy dogs, I get long nosed dogs, and I keep breeding for long nose, I keep breeding for fuzziness, and eventually I end up with a fuzzy long nosed dog. Okay, that's called artificial pressure. If you're fuzzy or long nosed, I let you breed. If you're not those things, I don't let you breed. So I have a positive selective pressure for long nosedness and fluffiness, and negative selective pressure for not having those things. This would be called artificial selection, and it does work. The Russians, for instance, took foxes, just ordinary foxes from nature, and over the course of about 80 years of experimentation, selecting only for docility, for being gentle, they ended up with these gentle foxes. weirdly, they ended up accidentally looking like regular dogs. Their ears became floppy, they became spotted, whatever. But the point is, artificial selection has been shown to work. Well, natural selection does the same thing. It's just if if you are more fit to survive in nature, then those genes will get selected for. And we call it natural selection. But it's not intentional. It's just if the mutation makes you more likely to survive, it gets selected for. If it makes you less likely to survive, it gets selected against. And there's some great examples of this. For instance, antibiotic resistant bacteria. So everybody knows you're supposed to take your antibiotics. If the doctor says take it for 10 days, by golly, take them for 10 days. What's happened, unfortunately, is people take them for 3 days. They feel better. They quit taking them. Well, what happened was in 3 days, you killed off the ones that had a normal genome that made them susceptible to this poison we call an antibiotic. But there was some in that population that had this random mutation that made them more resistant, less likely to die from it. Well, what you did, if you kept taking them, you would have killed all of them, and that gene that makes the bacteria resistant would never get expressed. But you quit taking your antibiotics. And so what happened is those ones survived. So they were selected for. They had a protection that got selected for, and now their offspring will have that gene. So we see this all the time. We see this with pesticides, um, with bugs on farms. We see this with herbicides, with plants that grow as weeds. It's a very common thing. But when we see this with bacteria, when we see this with insects, when we see this with plants, we've never actually seen it go all the way to forming a new species. But there's no reason to think that this would not happen. It's just that the window of time it takes to make a new species is very long, and humans have only been making these observations for 100 years or so. So selective pressure is a term I've used already. We should think about it. Basically, selective pressure is just whatever external agent or force that is driving this selection, that is making a gene a good one to have or a bad one to have. We call that selective pressure. So positive selective pressure basically makes you more likely to survive. So you have that antibiotic resistance. You're the green bug on a green background. Negative selective pressure makes you less likely to survive, and so it tends to get removed from the population's genome. So basically, we can look at selective pressure and think about what would cause selective pressure in nature. So basically, it comes down to resource availability. Access to food, shelter, and mates is an important thing. If you are more likely to get food, if you're more likely to find shelter, and if you're more likely to reproduce, your genes are going to get spread around more. And so whatever that mutation that you had that made you more likely to get food, more likely to find shelter, and more likely to find a mate, it's going to get spread throughout. It's going to become more common, and over time, all of the organisms of the species are going to have this. There's other environmental factors. So basically, just like bacteria can be resistant to poisons, there are environmental stressors: temperature, salinity, pressure, salinity, precipitation, all kinds of abiotic factors. And if you are equipped to live, say, in a hotter environment, then you can basically survive when others don't, and so that gene that lets you do that becomes more prevalent. And there's also biologic pressure, selective pressure. So camouflage lets you avoid predators. The ability to survive a disease. So when a disease happens and lots of members of the population die off, except the ones that have this gene that makes them less likely to die from that disease, guess what? That gene becomes more expressed. So that's selective pressures. There's a classic example. This did not lead to what we call speciation, the formation of a new species, but it clearly showed, it was a first accidental experiment that showed natural selection really does result in pretty big changes in the genome of species. So here's what happened. In England, I want to say like the 1800s, there was a kind of moth called the peppered moth, and it lived on trees. And the idea is it had wings that made it blend in with the lichen that grew on trees. Lichen is a symbiotic relationship between algae and fungus that you find on trees. We'll be talking about it soon enough. We're talking about indicator species. The vast majority of the moths, like 90-some% of them, have the genes that give them the speckled pattern that make them blend in. But a tiny fraction of them did not have that. They had a gene that made them have black wings. Well, these guys got eaten at a pretty high rate, so having that gene sucked. I mean, you didn't make it very much. So the vast majority of the moths had this one, very few of them had this one. Then the people in England decided like, hey, burning coal is a great idea. It helps us heat our houses. We get to like run steam engines, which lets us cut wood and move things around with trains. And all this soot was produced, and the soot landed on the trees and the forests around London and turned them black. And as that happened, almost done, buddy. As that happened, suddenly it became very advantageous to be a black moth, where it was very disadvantageous before, and it became very disadvantageous to look like lichen because all the lichen was covered with coal soot. Okay, so what happened was these biologists were keeping track of it, and look what happened. This was the peppered moth who had the speckled look, and this was its black brethren. There's so few of those. They started in the late 1800s to burn a lot of coal, and all of a sudden the population flip flopped. The frequency of the alleles that coded for that black wing became very prevalent in the population, and the alleles that coded for the speckled wings became very, very unusual in the population. Then people said, hey, we need to clean up our act. So, when the environmental movement happened in the 60s, people stopped putting all that coal in the air, and it went back the other way. Okay, so that's natural selection and evolution, and I'll talk to you again soon.